but let's jump into this. This is a fascinating story, one that is sort of slipped through the cracks of history. I actually discovered it when I was reading David McCullough's 1776, which is a great book. And it's really, if you look at this slide, which we're going to see this slide a lot because this really sums up so much. It's the amazing story of a 25-year-old Boston bookseller who in 1775 pulls 25 tons, or rather 60 tons, or 120,000 pounds, which is the equivalent of 28 SUVs, 300 miles in the dead of winter to George Washington, and changes the course of the Revolution, which is hard to believe, but it actually happened. Now, these cannons were up in Fort Ticonderoga. There's a great picture here of it, which is up on Lake Champlain and Lake George. It sort of guards a portage between the two. This fort was taken by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen. And it wasn't a great victory or anything. It was very lightly defended by the British because after the French and Indian War, they sort of thought, we don't need this fort anymore. But in fact, it's the back door to the colonies. But they realized too late it was strategically important. And so, but Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold were able to get up there and pretty much just take it without a shot. But what they found was there was 59 tons of cannons up there. And the problem was, though, there was no way to transport them. And Boston was 300 miles away. So in a way, it was sort of a non-starter. It was like, okay, they're here, but we can't do anything with them. So what's going on in Boston? Okay. In 1775, the British had holed up in Boston. Now, after Bunker Hill, Lexington, and Concord, George Washington arrives in June of 1775, and he's not a great general. The deity that is George Washington that comes down to us through history is half God, half man. But the fact is, he'd been living off his wife for 15 years, Martha Washington, who was very wealthy, and had been living the life of a planter. And in fact, it gets worse than that. When he was in the military with the British, he was really one of the reasons the French and Indian War kicked off because he bungled this one mission. So, in terms of experience, he didn't have a lot, and especially the situation in Boston, which is the British are holed up there, holding Boston, and the Americans surround it. So it's a siege. Now, in the siege, you need artillery. The Americans have none. They have no artillery at all. And worse than that, the army's sort of falling apart. People are mutinying. People just leave. There's no real concept. I'm calling it an army, but really it was a group of militias at this time. Okay. Now, in Boston, though, there's this guy, Henry Knox. He's a really interesting guy. He's big for the times. He's over 6 foot. He's large, has a lot of weight, very jolly fellow, and he's a bookseller. And he's been a bookseller really since he was 9. His father left. He went to work for some local booksellers, and then he got a store of his own. And it's a very popular store with the British and with the Americans, with the Bostonians. So it's sort of a salon almost. Well, a lot of radicals are going through there, John Adams and others, and he slowly starts to become sort of radicalized, if you will. And this is finally cemented with this, which is the Boston Massacre. Knox, and this is how the book actually opens up. Knox is walking along, he hears some bells ringing at night, and he runs to the center of town and right into the middle of the Boston Massacre. And he witnesses, Americans getting shot by the British. So from here on, he believes there has to be separation. He realizes there's no turning back and that America must separate from Britain. And so he starts to get known as the rebel bookseller around town. But he's actually a very good bookseller. He does something new nobody's done before, and that is blurbs. He uses blurbs to advertise books, which, we think, of course, but nobody had done that before. Also, he prices his books beneath everybody else. There was a feeling that only educated people should read books, people of means. Knox is like, no, everybody should read books. Poor people should read books too. So in this way, he sort of, cutting edge. He's a very friendly guy. He's very valuable. And so he does a good business. Now, he meets Lucy Flucker, who is the daughter of a royalist governor, actually, and a guy high up in the British echelon. And so, she's very taken with him, but her father does not want her to marry him. In fact, he says, if you marry him, I'll cut you off. You'll have nothing. But Lucy is in love with Knox. So, they do get married, amazingly. So Knox, who has no formal education, and really is just pulling himself up by his bootstraps, now is married to a very prominent daughter of this royalist family in Boston. And her father knows he's a rebel. In fact, a lot of people do. So that also makes this a very, very messy marriage. Now, outside, and this is a great slide here, Boston, Washington's army is falling apart. There is disease, there's starvation. They don't have enough powder. I mean, when Washington found out how much powder they had, he was just distraught, because without powder, you can't fight a war. And worse than that, the army doesn't hold together. Again, people just leave. They don't see any reason to stay. And, Washington writes his brother, famously, and says, if I had known this situation, I would have never taken this on. Because, and he feels like if General Howe gets any inclination of how bad things are, he's going to come out and just destroy them. So it's pretty bad. Now, we're going to go back a little bit to Lexington and Concord. This occurs, and Henry Knox realizes his time is very limited, and he's going to have to leave Boston. And it gets worse than that. Paul Revere, a friend of his, tips him off and say, hey, you're about to get arrested. And so Knox has this elaborate ruse. It's a great slide, isn't it? Knox has this elaborate ruse of, closing the store, making everything seem like it's normal. And then he and Lucy get into a boat, a little dinghy, and row out of the harbor at night. And they both realize they're leaving the life that they knew. Lucy realizes she'll probably never see her father or her family again. And Knox realizes that, his bookstore, his business, everything is basically over. That whole phase is over, and they're rowing to go into the jaws of this war, and that life will never be the same. So Lucy's pregnant too, just to complicate things even more. So Knox drops her off with some friends, and then he goes and joins the army. Well, he's very unimpressed with the army situation. He says it's totally disorganized. But Knox is a big reader of military books, and he's read a ton of books about forts, fortifications, cannons. He's drilled with a small train of artillery after work, after he closes the bookstore. So he's put to work building fortifications, and Washington is impressed with him. And then Washington bumps into him on the road. Knox is very voluble. He's very knowledgeable. They talk and talk and talk. And George Washington really values a can-do spirit, and he likes to surround himself with young, energetic officers, which is Knox. And Knox has no formal training in the military, but nobody really does in the Revolution. But he immediately meets Washington, and Washington makes him basically his aide-de-camp. So, very quickly, Knox is now at the side of George Washington, which is pretty amazing. Now, let's talk about the heights of Dorchester. Okay, so here's Boston. Bunker Hill is a big sort of height that's close by, and then there's the heights of Dorchester, but it's unoccupied, and it overlooks Boston. Okay. Now, the British are very aware of the heights of Dorchester, and they feel like, you know what, we should take that. And they even say to General Howe, we should take this because this will allow us to make sure that the Americans don't take it. Well, Howe says, you know what, the Americans don't have any artillery. Don't worry about the heights of Dorchester. Because the reason some of the British are worried about it is because if you put cannon up there, you can bomb Boston, you can see Boston there, and then you can bomb the fleet as well. So these two things, are a real threat. But Howe is just so confident that George Washington is, not a player, that he just doesn't know what he's doing. The army's falling apart. He says, if they take it, we'll just take it back. Okay, so still up there in Fort Ticonderoga are the cannons. Now, Washington knows about these cannons, and soon Henry Knox does. And Washington's very sly. He puts Henry Knox in charge of the artillery. And Henry Knox says, okay, great, where's the artillery? And George Washington says, well, there's none. You have to get some. So, he knows Knox is the kind of guy who will say, I can do anything. And 300 miles away are these cannons. And quickly Knox says, I'll go get them. He has no idea how to do it, no idea. And everybody else, George Washington's War Council says, do not do this. It's a waste of money. He will never do it. But Washington pushes on, and he goes to Congress, and he gets approval of the mission, gets some money, and tells Knox to go do it. So Knox and his brother William, they start out on November 17th, 1775, to go get these cannons and bring them back to Boston. Now, this slide here shows the oxen sleds. This is how they started. They just started out with some militia and their horses. They have no idea at this point how they're going to get the oxen sleds, which is going to be the way to transport these very heavy cannons, some which weigh 5,000 pounds. Well, they immediately hit a snowstorm, and it's just a horrible storm, and they almost freeze to death right away. So, it's not like they have polar gear. I mean, they just have whatever they wear. So, Knox is sort of a make-it-up-as-you-go guy. Well, they finally reach Fort George, and Fort George sits on Lake George, and on the other side of Lake George, on the back of Lake Champlain, is Fort Ticonderoga. But they got to cross Lake George. And Lake George, here's a great picture of it, is frozen, except for you can see that little tributary in the middle. And here's the thing, they're on a race. They're in a race, because if Lake George freezes, they can't come back. So, people don't travel. All right, first of all, in 1775, people don't travel generally, unless they have to. It's very hazardous. Two, you never travel in the winter. It's almost impossible. So this whole mission is just, fraught with danger and high degree of failure. But they get across Lake George, and they get there. And of course, the people in Fort Ticonderoga are like, who are these people? And Knox has to explain to them what they're doing, because he needs their help. And Henry Knox is never better than when he's talking. And so he enlists all these people to help him, because he needs their help, because they have a 3-mile portage to get back down from the fort to Lake George. And they've got to put all these cannons in these gondolas and bateaux and piragüas, which are basically flat-bottom boats. Now, again, these cannons, they weigh 120,000 pounds, 60 tons. And some of them weigh 5,000 pounds apiece. They're called Big Berthas. So he has to bring all these down, separate them out, and try and balance the weight. Well, these boats get very low in this freezing water, but they have no time to lose, because they have to try and get back, and then they head back down the lake. And, coming up was not bad. Going back down is terrible. Now, they have these little sails. They don't work. They have a headwind. They have to start using poles to cross Lake George, and they immediately start freezing, and it gets worse. Some of the gondolas sink. Now, anybody else would say, okay, we lost a few cannons. Henry Knox stops, gets people from Fort Ticonderoga to come help him pull these cannons up from the bottom of the lake. I mean, it's unbelievable. But he feels like he can't even lose one cannon, because he knows George Washington needs every single cannon. Well, they get as far as Sabbath Island, and they bump into Indians. Now, this is at a time where Indians basically massacre just about anybody they bump into, because there's been really bad blood between the colonists and the Indians, and just the Americans. And it just has not been a good thing. But a guy named General Schuyler had negotiated a treaty with the Iroquois Indians, allowing Knox to pass. So in fact, the Indians actually helped them, and they built a big fire and keep Knox and his party from freezing. But again, and this is a great picture of what Lake George looks like in winter, frozen. They continually have problems with boats sinking with these cannons. And by the way, the boats all spread out. You kind of have a vision of all these boats together in one group moving across the lake. It's just not the way it was. There's no communication. Nobody's quite sure what's going on with the boats in the back, with the boats in the front. It's really sort of an act of faith that these boats are going to arrive at all down to Fort George. So Knox goes ahead. A couple of reasons he goes ahead is, one, he has to start working on the next leg of the journey, which is the oxen and the sleds. And the boats do slowly start coming to Fort George. So he goes into a room, and that night he writes a couple of letters, one to Lucy and one to George Washington. With Lucy, hasn't been real straight. He told her, oh, there's not going to be any problem. It's not going to be dangerous. This won't take any time at all. And now he kind of tells her, this is going to take a lot longer than I thought, and this is pretty difficult. And again, she's staying with strangers. She's pregnant. So they both their lives are really on the line and tied up now with the revolution, the success or failure. Knox is a zealot, and he's sort of a religious man as well. And so, with zealots, they rise or fall with their cause. Then he writes a letter to George Washington. And he also has to kind of, tell him it's been a little difficult getting across the lake, but he still is trying to pad it up and say, I hope in 16 or 17 days' time to be able to present your excellency with a noble train of artillery. Now, it's a very interesting use of words. A noble train of artillery. What's he doing? He's elevating it. Knox believes America is divinely inspired, that God is on the side of this new country based on liberty and freedom, and that God also is on the side of him getting this artillery. And that's why he says, watch it, it's a noble train of artillery. So it's now a quest. It's a holy quest. And this is part, his mission is part of the overall mission of developing this brand new country on the face of the earth. So now, here we're back to this photo again, or this painting. And this is how they're going to do it. They need oxen, sleds. If you look closely at it, those are the Berkshire Mountains. And you can see the struggle that everybody's going through. But here's the problem. Knox doesn't have any oxen or sleds yet. He's been negotiating with a guy named Captain Palmer, who's basically fleeced him and taken his money and done nothing for him in terms of getting his oxen and sleds. And then there's General Schuyler, who was supposed to help him, but that hasn't happened either. So Knox takes off with about 3 or 4 other men and goes down to Albany to find out what's going on with the oxen and sleds. He nearly freezes to death. They get lost in the woods. He reaches Schuyler, and sure enough, he finds out that Captain Palmer has totally ripped him off. This is Knox's naivete. He believes he can do everything, but in fact, he can't. So there's a lot of bungling. But at the same time, he meets Jim Becker and his Teamsters. Now, Teamsters in 1775 did essentially what they do today. They move heavy freight, and they move it with oxen and sleds and horses and whatever it takes. They do a lot of moving equipment for the Army. So he now has this mission, this way to pull this off, and Schuyler gets him the oxen and sleds, and Becker is now going to sort of run it. So finally, they start back down on January 2nd. So we're back to this photo again, but now this is the way it is. Now you see they have and they broke it up into 5 packets, basically. They divided the can up into 5 groups, and with it goes to like 2 oxen to a sled, sometimes 4 oxen to a sled with the heavier, cannons. You had about 90 oxen and 45 sleds. And this is what they're going. This is the noble train artillery now that Knox is talking about. This is the noble train artillery that it has to make it back. So here's a map of him coming back, and it's a little cut up by the moniker going through the middle of it. But you can see he has to come all the way down. He has to cross the Hudson River 4 times. All right, in his journey. And then he makes a left turn as you're coming down, and then he has to go through the Berkshire Mountains, which is very, very difficult. So frozen lakes, frozen rivers, and rivers that are also thawing, and then frozen mountains, and then straight across to Massachusetts. Very, very difficult route. Well, immediately start out, and they hit problems. I call these roads that they're following, they're really hunting trails. And trading trails, and so they're very bad. And the sleds tip over. These 5,000, 10,000 pounds of iron are in the snow. They have to use pulleys and ropes to wrap them around trees to bring them back over, disconnect the oxen. It is just problematic and very, very slow and very hard to move. But they head down towards the Hudson. Now, this is the Hudson in, summer, and it looks just beautiful, right? This is the vein of America, really, the Hudson River. And here's the way it looks in winter. Okay, so this is what Knox has to cross with, this 59 tons or 60 tons, 120,000 pounds of, oxen, sleds, and cannons. Now, the problem is the ice isn't thick enough a lot of places. So what Knox does is he drills holes down into the ice. And the way this works is the water flows up over the ice and thickens. And so he does this, all these different points where he thinks they're going to cross. And again, he's sort of doing this in an advanced party. These 5 groups have already all separated. They're all they're like a caterpillar, where the front's up here and the back's back here. And the way they cross the Hudson is very interesting. A teamster carries an axe next to the oxen and the sled. Why? Because if that sled starts to go through the ice, he's got to cut those oxen free so they don't lose the oxen. So it's very nerve-wracking. They have to walk across very slow. The ice is creaking and cracking, and it's just very difficult to cross with a 5,000-pound cannon. And again, this is a time where they have sonar. They can figure out how thick the ice is or anything like that. They just have to go on faith. And the thing is, the temperatures are all over the place. It gets real cold, and it kind of warms up, and they have a thaw. Well, the first time they get across, for the first crossing, the second crossing, though, they aren't so lucky. And this happens. They go right down to the ice. Now, the teamster swings his axe, cuts the oxen free, but the cannon goes down. But Knox will not leave any cannons. So then what they do is they have a rope tied to the cannon. They have to take that rope, take it all the way to shore, wrap it around trees with pulleys, take the oxen off, and have the oxen pull that thing all the way to the shore, drag it to the shore. Again, anybody else would have just left it, but not Henry Knox. So this just slows them down. And again, these guys are doing this in freezing weather they don't have thermal vests or down gloves. They are freezing, okay? And of course, this is a modern cannon, but I thought it kind of looked a little bit like a cannon in ice. But, pulling these things back up is ridiculous. So now they're going to make the turn, and they're headed for the Berkshires. Now, the Berkshire Mountains are just these frozen peaks, all right? And Knox famously says, I should let you know this. Knox kept a diary through this whole thing. And it's one of the primary sources I used in writing the book. And when he hits the Berkshire, he says, I can see all the kingdoms of heaven from here. But look at that. That's what he's got to cross with oxen sleds and 120,000 pounds of cannons. And he writes in his diary and says, I don't see how anybody can cross this with cannons. I don't understand how we're going to do it. So really, this whole thing could just end. And again, Washington's generals believe they're never going to see Henry Knox again. I mean, people at this time would just go out in the wilderness and disappear. They would just freeze to death and be gone. They think that this is the biggest folly Washington has ever tried to do. And, it's just going to be this big failure. And they've lost some money and time, and Knox will never return. Well, right now, Knox is considering the same thing. So now we're back to this photo again, because this is them going through the Berkshires. And you can see these guys pulling, straining. A lot of times you got to take the oxen off. The sleds fall off. Also, the sleds would go backwards down the mountain and nearly kill people. And Henry Knox a few times had to jump out of the way. They had to use the pulleys wrapped around trees. They would hit sheer cliffs. They'd have to use block and tackle to lift the cannons up. And they had to put things under the runners to keep them from going back down. But it's painstaking. And also, the air is getting very thin and they're freezing. And this has been going on for months now, okay, in the dead of winter. And it's been an awful winter. So finally, it all breaks down way up in the mountains. And this is a great photo of the Berkshires here. They're up there in the mountains, and the teamsters say, no more. we're not going any further. We're done. We're leaving. And so Henry Knox is up there with this 120,000 pounds of cannons. And this is it. This is going to be the disaster. And this is where Knox kicks it in and gives this speech. And he says, basically, this is for the unborn millions. This is for the people yet to be born, for this country that's bigger than us, way bigger than us, will stand for all time. And it's really the equivalent of Washington crossing the Delaware. This is Henry Knox's finest moment. This is really, which, by the way, he will be very involved in the crossing of the Delaware, too. He will actually get people into these boats. But this is Knox's crossing the Delaware. And, I believe in history, there's people who are destined to do one thing. And this is what Henry Knox was destined to do. And so in this moment, when it all was going to go south, when the whole thing was falling apart, Knox talks for 2 hours. And he convinces these guys to keep going. He appeals to something bigger. And he says, we'll get new oxen. We're going to get through this thing. And indeed they do. They finally start to get clear of the Berkshires. And now people are starting to hear about Henry Knox's noble train. And, they hit these towns, and it's equivalent of astronauts coming to somebody's town. People have never seen artillery this big. People don't leave their towns in 1775. They live and die there. And so here's Knox coming into these towns, and he would take one of the mortars called the Old Sow, which was a monstrous mortar, and he'd blow it off for the townspeople. They've never heard anything like this. And they'd give them food and drink and all this. They were basically lions, but they all knew this was going to Washington at Boston. Now, there's another thing we should talk about here, too, and that is what Knox could have been stopped at any moment by the Tories. America was not, let's all separate from the British. At best, it wasn't even 50% of the people. It's totally divided. Colonies hadn't even sent the representatives to the Continental Congress. A lot of people were waiting to see what happens in Boston. If the British decimated the Americans, they're like, well, okay, that's it. So a lot of people did not want Knox to succeed, and they could have easily stopped him. And it gets worse. British spies were telling the British in Boston, hey, these guys are bringing these cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. But the British military system is one of privilege, and only the gentility, the nobility would make it into the upper ranks. And so when these spies would come, the officers would just dismiss them and say, nobody goes out and does something like that in the dead of winter. That's just not going to happen. So if they had listened to these spies, they could have easily come and stopped Knox. They could have taken on a small contingent of soldiers and just stopped the train right there. But they didn't. And so the townspeople all help him move on. And again, they fire the Old Sow and keep going. And they finally reach Springfield. And again, Knox's journey is one bad thing happening after another. A lot of the Teamsters leave then. They go, we've gone far enough. So Knox has to scramble around and get guys to replace him. He has to scramble around and get more oxen. But he's getting close now. He's about 30 miles outside of Boston. And so Knox gallops ahead. Now he's been gone for almost 3 months. And Washington comes out of his headquarters after another disastrous meeting with his war council, where basically he realizes he can't do anything. And they're waiting desperately for these cannons. And he sees this rider approaching. And he thinks it's a messenger with an express message. And yet then he sees this big man with his big beard covered in snow with this rag wrapped around his left hand. Now, Knox had a hunting accident and it blew off some fingers. And so he would always put a colorful scarf around his left hand. And then Washington realized that Knox had returned at that moment. And indeed, Knox had made it back with the cannons. So the actual train arrives on January 24th, 1776. They finally get back to Washington. Now, this changes the war right there. Just the whole equation of the war gets changed instantly from these 59 tons of cannons because now they have a way to get the British out of Boston. And better yet, the British don't know anything about it. They simply don't believe the Americans, because the methodology of war at this time was you hunker down for the winter, and for the British, they're enjoying themselves, going to theaters, going to dinner, they're just whooping it up. And then in the spring, in the summer, and some in the fall, you fight the wars, and then you go back down into winter camp. So the thought that the Americans were up to all this is just unthinkable. They just don't believe it. But Washington immediately sees this opportunity, and in one night, he gets, and by the way, Washington was still entertaining sort of a frontal assault, but all his officers, no, put those cannons up on Dorchester. So in one night, they get all the cannons up using the oxen, again, the sleds, all the way up to the heights of Dorchester. It's an incredible operation. Knox actually starts a low bombardment to cover the noise of getting these other cannons up to Dorchester, up to the heights of Dorchester. But by the morning, they're all up there. So now these cannons are overlooking Boston, all right? And the British have no idea. And George Washington comes up there at dawn, and he gives a speech. And basically he says, remember this moment, because this is the moment the war is going to change. And we all have to do our duty now. And it's, it's really Knox's greatest moment, because Knox is just waiting for the signal from Washington. And then as dawn breaks, it's actually the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, March 5th, Knox starts to bomb Boston. Now, General Howe is in bed with his concubine. He has the wife of another, and these shells just start falling all over the place, blowing up these wooden homes, fires erupting. They all run out into the street and look up, and they see all these cannons skylit against the dawn, and they simply can't believe it. They can't believe the Americans have these cannons and then got them all up on Dorchester Heights, and they never saw it happen. And by the way, while they were doing it, British spies said, they're moving cannons up onto the heights of Dorchester. And again, the British officer said, you're crazy. There's no way they do it. They don't have any cannons. They couldn't do it. So again, they could have stopped them, but they didn't. And so the British admiral, who's sitting in ships in Boston Harbor, tells General Howe, you got to get those cannons or we're leaving, because the big Bertha cannons, the 5,000 pounders, can throw a shell 2 miles, which is in range of these ships. Be a lucky shot, but they can't risk it. So Howe knows he's got to get them out. So what's he do? He launches an attack. But the British troops all get into the boats, and they're very, very downcast because Washington's waiting for him, and Knox is just going to decimate him with these cannons. And a freak snowstorm occurs, just a northeaster, and blows out the boats, basically. And so they don't get anywhere. And Howe realizes, well, he can't get them down. The Navy's saying, we're going to leave, and he's now vulnerable. And so he makes a decision, and he tells Washington, we're going to abandon Boston. If you leave us alone, we won't burn it, and we're going to leave. And so with that, Howe, the entire British Army, and all these loyalists who believe they're going to be shot if, when the rebels all come in, when the Americans take possession, all get aboard these British ships, and this massive movement of troops and people and livestock and all sorts of things moves out. And Henry Knox is up on the heights of Dorchester watching it. Little do the British know that the reason they have to leave is because of this big, overweight bookseller who did the impossible, went 300 miles and brought these cannons back. And it gives the Americans their first victory of the American Revolution, which is amazing because this gets the French saying, hey, we can support the Americans against the British. And it also gets the country united. Yeah, we're going to separate. And so all the colonies now send their representatives to Congress. This is the shot in the arm Washington needed. And so Washington allows Knox to sort of lead him back into the Boston. It's really the prodigal son returning. He goes back to his old bookstore. He sees the bookstore's been ransacked and there's nothing left, but he reflects on how far he's come, how he was just this bookseller. And then in less than a year later, he's returning as this colonel of the artillery who's responsible basically for this victory over the British, giving him the first victory of the American Revolution, which again, there's a long way to go, but this kept the movement alive. This gave them breathing room keep fighting on. Now, after this, Knox becomes Washington's right-hand man. He's with him all the way to Yorktown. He was very instrumental in crossing the Delaware. He's been overshadowed by Washington a lot because, Washington is this towering figure of history, but Knox was with him, and Knox was very, very good at what he did. He set up the cannon when they crossed Delaware and mowed down the Hessian soldiers that allowed Washington to get that victory. And he's just very good at logistics, and he creates the whole artillery wing of the army. Then, of course, once America is established, he becomes the first Secretary of War, and staying with Washington. But really, his shining moment was here. This was really Knox's moment of history, and really underscores necessity is the mother of invention. Knox is really about that. He did what he had to do with what he had, and in the worst times, in the worst winter, he was able to persevere. Now, Knox finally leaves Washington, because he wants to make some money. Really, he's been with the Revolution and the Army, and then the government, and so he wants to kind of go out as private citizen. But he's not a good businessman. He builds a huge mansion in Maine. He's in debt, and then in a strange confluence of events, he gets a throat infection, and he dies on October 21st, 1806. And unfortunately, he's very in debt, and Lucy has to sell off most of the land for the mansion, and she dies destitute. And again, history sort of, we know of Henry Knox from Fort Knox, and what a lot of people don't know is he established West Point. But he did set up these markers in 1926, Massachusetts to New York, and you can actually follow his trail. There's 56 markers marking the trail. I'll read you just the very, very last paragraph of the book. Sort of sums it all up. In writing to George Washington from the frozen confines of Fort George and promising more than he could deliver, Knox embodied that emerging American ethos. He had nearly lost the cannons in the lake, and he had no oxen or sleds to transport the artillery across the frozen rivers, wilderness, and mountains ahead of him. He had no idea how he could do it. Yet he declared that in 17 days, Washington would have his noble train of artillery. Knox reflected the nobility of a country founded on an ideal that still shines back at us today. By putting something above his own life, Knox hitched himself to the train that began in the frozen snows in 1775 and continues today. A train of nobility shining the way for the yet unborn millions. And with that, I can take any questions you might have. I know we covered a lot, so a lot of things to talk about. We can go into other parts.
Hey, William, thanks so much.
Oh, sure.
That was excellent.
Excellent. Hope it came
All right,
across.
so as we're waiting for folks to enter their questions into the chat, I just wanted to ask a little bit about the inability of the British, I guess, officers from understanding that, the intelligence that they were hearing was actually true. Like, did they just assume, like you said, when it's winter, no one's doing anything and they're all just like staying put?
Yeah, I mean, the British are a very class-based system. So let's compare them to the American Army. So really, you could only become an officer if you were born into it, if you were of that upper class, if you were connected to the government or royalty, or you had some connection. That it was a patronage sort of system. So they really, then you jump down to the British regular, who they were really a lot of times the bottom rung of society. It was a very hard life for a British regular. So the spies were even lower than them. They were, usually some Americans, some Tories, somebody, who figured for some money they could sell out the Americans. So, and the British looked down on all Americans. They just thought they were just these rebels, these rabble, these commoners who should, be scraping their boots because you know what? They gave them this great opportunity, and now what do they have? What kind of thanks are they getting? They're rebelling. So, and let's take the American Army. The American Army was driven by ability, by you were rewarded if you showed that you could do something, and so that's the only way it would work. And Washington was very, very attuned to that. That if somebody showed promise, if they had a can-do spirit, or he just saw talent. So it was really a talent-based system, and it had to be because all of his officers, most of them had no experience at all. So he had to find talent quickly, and he found a lot of young men who he would elevate, and they would become generals or colonels, and with virtually no training at all. Back to the British system, which is these guys who are had always had privilege their whole life, and now they're in the British military, and the officers had great privileges where they would dine and go to balls and dances and theater, and then the rest of the regulars were sleeping and freezing in tents. So when they would get this information, it wouldn't go up the train. It would basically hit a low-level officer who'd be like, that's crazy. Or if it did go, the next level would say, nah, that's no way. But it also is, you know what? This isn't how war is fought. War is fought between gentlemen in the spring and in the summer and in the fall. And then in winter, you go into winter camp. So they could not believe they were going to get these cannons and bringing them back.
Wow, that's an incredible story. I feel like maybe if I was a child in a school on the East Coast, I would know more about these characters. Is it? You think that's true?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, certainly in New York and Massachusetts, I did a lot of, when I was doing the book tour, I did a lot of interviews out there with radio stations because they know of it. And when I decided to do this book, I realized there were no books on this. That there were some kids' books, some little illustrated kids' books, but nobody had taken on, this expedition. And it really was. It was the Knox expedition. And so, researching was a little tough because I had to, find his diary. Then I had to find the papers of Henry Knox. And then I had to take the other people. And there's two military guys who had done a book on Knox. One of them was self-published. The other was for the Department of Defense. And they came to very different conclusions in how he did it. So I had to kind of go between those two and then use logic, go, this is probably how they did it, using the 5 packets, the 5 groups of moving the sleds. And then, of course, the whole thing of not having the oxen and sleds, that was lost to history. I mean, whenever you read about it, you never read about that. But basically, Knox was the kind of a guy who would say, I can do it. And then he'd try and figure out how to do it. And a lot of times things didn't go well, and again, when he told his wife, he's like, oh, it's no big deal. I'm just going to get these cannons. Well, he was gone for 3 months, but Washington recognized that. He recognized how much he needed that. He needed people who could do the impossible over and over. And that was Henry Knox.
Yeah. Well, okay. So we had one comment. So Vi says, our daughter knows about this story because of a Nathan Hale Hazardous Tales graphic novel. So There you go. Kids, yeah. Some kids have been reading about it in certain ways.
Yeah, I mean, it does, there have been some cartoons. It's kind of, it's been, it's a little bit like my book, Madam President, The Secret Presidency of Edith Wilson, where some people knew that Edith Wilson had run the country from 1919 to 1921. They'd heard about it, but they never got the full story. So when you take these corners of history is very much like, certain things get pushed along and certain things don't. And again, George Washington was just this bigger than life figure. So Henry Knox sort of got overshadowed, and Washington was given credit for forcing the British out of Boston and, getting the first victory of the American Revolution, as he should. But it was really Henry Knox's incredible mission that allowed that to happen.
Well, speaking of another corner of history, do you want to talk a minute about Sally Rand? Because I know you said your book is coming out soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's Sally Rand, and she came to prominence. I don't know how many of your people out there read Al Capone in the 1933 World's Fair, but basically Sally Rand was a hillbilly from the Ozarks who went out west, ran away with the circus, met Cecil B. DeMille. He immediately changed her name from Harriet Beck to Sally Rand because he saw, an atlas. She became a silent movie star. Then when the talkies came in, she blew out, ended up going to Chicago, broke, sleeping in alleys, and then there was a tryout in the Paramount Club on State Street. So she went to a secondhand store and bought these 2 giant ostrich feathers that weighed 7 pounds apiece. Goes to the tryout. She had a little outfit, but it didn't fit. So they go, just go on naked. So she does. She gets the job. Then, she kind of wants to try and get back to Hollywood. And she's thinking, well, maybe if I can hook up with the 1933 World's Fair, I can get some publicity. Well, they go, no, we don't need a fan dancer. So she comes up with a plan. She gets a boat. She gets a horse, paints her body white. Now, the fair is all on Norley Island. So she takes this boat around to the back on the opening night of the fair where they're entertaining all the mucky mucks on a stage, gallops through the fair. The horse jumps up onto the stage. Sally Rand's on the horse. Everybody's like, oh my God, a naked woman on a white horse at the Chicago World's Fair. She's immediately arrested, then immediately hired. She makes $5,000 a week at the World's Fair from then on, 17 shows a day. And she becomes instantly famous, and that fame lasts for 40 years. How did that happen? Well, in 1933, the worst year of the Great Depression, her dance was to classical music done under a blue light, and people could escape for that 7 minutes. I mean, we can escape the second we turn on the television. They couldn't escape through anything, but they went and saw Sally Rand, they could. And so that's the story, and how she was on To Tell the Truth. She was on all these different shows, and then she ended up dancing for the astronauts, believe it or not, when she was 60 years old. The Apollo astronauts heading for the moon in the Houston Coliseum, and it was immortalized in the movie The Right Stuff. And she lived up all the way up to 1979.
Wow. Her life sounds like it parallels Mae West.
Funny you should bring that up because I have a chapter that addresses that. But Mae West was backed up by Hollywood. Mae West did very, very successful movies. And she wrote a lot of plays and things like that. So she too was a sort of a sex symbol, but Sally Rand was the first one who was really sort of that working class girl next door. She had that quality about her, who came up from the bottom. Mae West sort of, again, movie industry sort of held her up through all her trials and tribulations. And Sally Rand died broke. In fact, it's worse than that. Sammy Davis Jr. Had to pay her medical bills of $10,000 at the end. And he did that because she had helped him along. So really, Sally Rand is more of that straight American Gothic who came from nothing and went up from there. And she did become rich and famous. But of course, like many rich and famous people, she lost it all.
Wow. All right. Well, I just want to remind everybody that's still around, we were recording tonight's Zoom. So we're going to post that on our YouTube channel just as quick as we can. And then, look forward to seeing you around here again sometime soon. Mr. Hazelgrove, thanks so much.
Oh, thanks for having me. And if you want more, just go to williamhazelgrove.com and you can get the book anywhere.
All right. Take care. Have a good night.
Okay. Thank you.